Okay, this should be working, so let's get started. Just going to pull this back up for just a minute and make sure that we are working. Okay, it appears we are. All right, now that all the testing is out of the way, let's get started. So here's what I want to do now during this classroom session that we have for the next 2.5 hours. First, I want to talk about the test and go over just a few things that I saw and a few things that I think that I hope will help as you go forward into the next test. And then I want to talk about how this lecture is going to work. In fact, I'll do that now. So what we're going to do this week, we're actually covering 2 different chapters. We're covering B2B marketing, which is chapter 6 for most of you, and we're also covering international marketing, which is chapter 7 for most of you. So I'm going to have 2 separate lectures. That way you don't have to watch the whole thing all at once if you're not able to. Each one is going to have some sort of a discussion board component. So as you know, in our class, when we're live on campus, we typically will watch some videos and we'll talk about some things. And so what we're going to do at the end of this lecture, I'm going to have you go to another part of Blackboard and watch a video and then answer some questions in the discussion board. Now, on the discussion board, in order to get full credit for the class, you're required to respond to the questions thoughtfully and completely. What does that mean? Well, it certainly means more than just 1 or 2 sentences. And when you're responding to your other classmates, it means more than just saying, hey, great idea. It means actually building upon what they said and having some sort of dialogue in there as well. So each week you receive about 20 points for your participation in the class. And I'm very generous when we're on campus. Everyone seems to raise their hand and answer questions and ask questions. Some more than others, but for the most part, everyone has done well and they've gotten the full points. Now, in the online version, we're going to do it a little bit differently. Your points are going to be based upon how well you respond on the discussion board. So keep that in mind. So we're going to start here in just a minute talking about B2B marketing, and then there'll be a discussion board post. And then assuming you're going in order, you'll then open up the second lecture, which is going to be on international marketing, and we'll have the same type of activity. So your quiz for next week. Now, if we were on campus this week, you'd be taking a quiz on consumer behavior. And recall at the end of class, I said if you can answer the questions at the end of the chapter found in the Assurances of Learning section, that you'll probably be okay and do just fine on the quiz. And that's going to be the case next week as well, except your quiz is going to cover last week's lecture on consumer behavior, as well as this week's lecture on B2B marketing and international marketing. And if you can answer the questions under the Assurance of Learning sections, you'll be okay. It's still going to be 5 questions. It's still going to be short answer as the first one was, but the topics, the concepts, and who knows, maybe even word for word, the questions are going to come from the Assurances of Learning section in your textbook, okay? So with that, let's get started on this first lecture here. B2B marketing. Now, just as a side note, as you sit here and look at the cover of the textbook, maybe it's just me, but that path that leads from the tree to that valley looks like bacon. So anyway, maybe I'm hungry, but that's what I thought of. All right. So let's start talking about B2B marketing. We have to define things. For some reason, we always have to put definitions on things. But don't focus right now so much on what you see on the screen, but just think about it. Intuitively, B2B marketing, business-to-business marketing, is essentially businesses marketing to other businesses as opposed to B2C, which is businesses to consumers. So B2B marketing is essentially businesses marketing to other businesses. Or the textbook definition, organizational sales and purchases of goods and services to support production of other products to facilitate daily company operations or for resale. So basically, it's businesses buying other products, businesses for either them to sell or perhaps as a raw material or as an input into some kind of a manufacturing process. Perhaps it's even the manufacturing equipment itself, or it's pieces of the manufacturing equipment, or it's just things to keep the business running. So Apple computers can be both in the B2B and the B2C arena because they're selling to both businesses who use Apple products for their business, as well as to consumers, students, and other people who are just interested in having their own personal computer. So you don't have to define yourself as just a B2B company or a B2C company. However, what a lot of businesses do who sell to both, to businesses and consumers, is they will typically have different operations. So, for example, at AT&T, they have their own business sales unit, and they function like their own division within the company. Okay, so that is what B2B marketing is all about. So here's some differences. If you look at things such as product and promotion, distribution, customer relation, the decision-making process, and price, you'll see that there are some differences if it's B2B or if it's B2C, or business to business versus consumer. So for example, the products are oftentimes relatively technical in nature. Certainly other services coming with it are important. Now again, this isn't always the case. Apple Computer can sell the exact same computer to businesses as they do to the consumer market. But what you're going to get it for, what your needs are, it might be more technical in nature. Even companies who sell light bulbs, some of the, if you're purchasing the light bulb through the commercial division, for example, of GE or Sylvania, some of the light bulb manufacturing company, you're probably going to get a little bit more technical aspects. You're going to, when the light bulbs come in the mail, it's going to have some more technical aspects to it. And also, there's typically a lot more variety in a business setting than there is in a consumer setting. All right, on the in terms of how you promote the product, there's a lot of emphasis on personal selling, whereas in consumer marketing, it's more advertising. And so you're going to have a sales force out there making contacts, going face-to-face, even being more involved in social media to make those relationships, whereas in B2C marketing, it's more about advertising to the masses. In distribution, it's typically relatively short, sometimes even direct channels to market. And then, of course, on the B2C side, you're going to pass through a lot more links. And so businesses are typically set up to buy direct from the manufacturer sometimes, for example. And sometimes even products are purchased from a distributor who can then sell into the consumer market. So sometimes it's shorter just because it's actually is the middleman who's purchasing the product. And sometimes it's shorter because businesses will typically buy in volume, and so the seller will typically offer the buyer some kind of a volume discount. Whereas a consumer, you and I aren't going to purchase 1,000 light bulbs for our home, but if you are buying 1,000 light bulbs, you could typically go to GE or whoever it is and get some kind of a volume discount. Consumer relationships, it's certainly a lot more on building those relationships and having long-standing relationships, whereas in consumer it's more infrequent, short advertising, sometimes through social media. There's a lot more involved in the decision-making process within an organization. There's a lot of layers that things have to go through. There's budget approvals, there's policies, there are procedures, whereas on the consumer side, it typically isn't as complex. Even if it's a household that has to make a decision, it might be something as complex as the husband and wife have to consult with each other. Perhaps they bring the children in or other family members, but other than that, it's not really all that complex. And then price, on the B2B side, there's competitive bidding sometimes. There's list prices. You can purchase wholesale. Like I said, sometimes there's volume discounts, whereas in consumer, yes, there might be some volume discounts, but it might be more something like 3 for $1 or 50 cents each or something like that. Okay, and it's not just products. Companies can purchase services from one another as well. I used to work for a staffing company. I sold people, essentially, is what I did. So I worked for a temp agency. I was a branch manager there. And so what I would do is I would go to businesses, manufacturing companies. We had a large printing press as a client, and I would sell my services to these businesses. I would offer my people for a markup. So maybe the hourly employee was being paid $8 an hour. And so I would go in there and I would say, I will offer these people to you for $10 an hour, $11 an hour, and I was covering all the other costs that were involved. So it's not just products; it's also services. There's several different influences within the B2B market as well. Certainly, looking at the environment, this is where something like environmental scanning is important. You really need to understand what is going on in the market. Well, what's going on in the economy? Are there anything in terms of the political market that we need to consider? All those have a factor in B2B selling. Certainly, as I showed you on the last slide, this idea that making decisions is a lot more complex. And then interpersonal, this idea of having personal relationships are critical also. There's still very much word of mouth amongst businesses in terms of, hey, who do you use for your staffing services? Who do you purchase your industrial strength cleaning products for, etc. Now, if you're trying to make a decision within the buying process, it's very similar to the consumer side. You're going to look at your goals as an organization. If you're purchasing products, you're going to look at your goals. Is this going to fit what we're trying to do? Yes, it's more expensive, but is it going to help us have better products or services in the long run? Or, we sure are paying a lot for light bulbs. We sure are paying a lot for our cleaning products. We sure are paying a lot for this manufacturing, for this piece of equipment. Are there ways that we can cut costs in that area? Okay, some firms focus entirely on business markets. Others, like I said, play in both areas. Caterpillar, for example, you'd be very hard-pressed to just go and say you want to purchase a bulldozer or a backhoe just for your own personal use, but maybe you do, but it's going to be difficult for you to go to Caterpillar directly and purchase from them. You have to have a business set up. Grainger is an example. They're a large distribution company. They sell to plumbing supply companies and electricians. They're big in the building supply area. Boeing is another. If you want to fork out several $1 million, I'm sure Boeing will sell you your very own airplane for personal use. But typically that's a B2B type of acquisition. And so it's diverse, it's international. You need to understand the customs of businesses within other markets, understanding that how you sell something in the United States, it's going to be different than how you sell something over in Asia, for example. I remember a professor telling me about him working for a large chemical company, and he went over to Japan, and they went out with their prospective client. They went to lunch. they went golfing, they did some other things, and they just talked about a lot of other things that were not business related. And then at the very end, that's when the sale was made. Whereas in some other cultures, it's very much you get in there, you do your business, and you're done. It's even that way within the United States. If you think about East Coast selling, or selling to businesses on the East Coast, or even people who are who grew up in the East Coast, it's a lot different than even out in Texas or out in the Midwest, for example. Okay, so what are the components of the business market? You have the commercial market, trade industries, government, public and private institutions. The commercial market is the largest. It's individuals and firms that basically buy and sell product that they can use to put into other goods and services. And if we were in class right now, we could probably think about a place that we go that is very much involved in selling to us as the consumers, but there's so much behind the scenes business to business type of selling that's going on. Let's take, for example, McDonald's. I had the opportunity, I think it was an opportunity, it was very eye-opening, but I had the opportunity many years ago to tour the manufacturing plant of a company that manufactured a very large percentage of the hamburgers, patties for McDonald's. And they showed me this process from the very beginning, when there's just this huge, massive amount of beef, which quite frankly looked very disgusting. Made me not want to eat at McDonald's for a while. But then they showed me the process, how it goes through, how the meat is treated, even to the point of how it's pressed into patties and then it's cooked. And they take a random sample of the patties from each batch, and they cook it, and they have someone who's actually there who tastes these hamburger patties every day. I forget how many she said she tasted, but she said she doesn't eat burgers outside of work. And if I remember right, she was actually very skinny as well. You would think somebody who ate hamburgers all day would be a little bit on the heavy side, perhaps, but I guess instead of eating out after she got home from work, she exercised. So for us as consumers to go into McDonald's and buy hamburgers, there's this company that makes all the beef and ships it all over the world. There's companies who make the little cardboard bins, who make the bags. There's companies who make the grills. There's companies who make the fryers, who make the oil that goes in the fryers, who make the little filters that clean the fryers. There's companies who come out and clean out the grease traps. And so all of these companies are involved in some kind of a B2B transaction with McDonald's in one way. Trade industries, certainly retailers or wholesalers that purchase products so they can then go and resell to others. I worked for a distributor of building products. I did some marketing with them. They were looking to create a new strategy because they were about to get shut out from their current manufacturers, and so they were very much a company that from businesses and then sold to others. The government is another example of a B2B market, and then public and private institutions as well. But the commercial market is the largest and probably the one that we can most understand. So some of the characteristics of a B2B market, certainly there's usually some kind of a geographic market concentration. The U.S. business market is actually more concentrated than the consumer market. Certain industries are going to be closer to their customers, or at least to the main buying center. Even in terms of distributors, if you are a company that purchases lobster and other seafood products from you're going to want to make sure that you're close to the Sure, you're going to make sure that you're close to water so you can get the product. And then, of course, the internet is changing it in some ways, but when you think about a supply chain, certainly the closer you are to it, the more likely, or the greater competitive advantage you're going to have. Okay, there's also, it's also influenced by the size, a number of buyers. There's a limited number of buyers in the business market, and it's usually, if it's more of a limited buyer market, it's usually more of the large organizations that are going to have multiple buyers. Okay, so how do you segment these businesses? Much like in the consumer market, where you might segment by age or geographic, some sort of interest, psychographics. There's ways that you segment within the B2B market as well. So you have segmenting by demographics in terms of the size of the company, either by employee or revenue. The NAICS, which is basically the industry code. In your textbook, there's a table that you can look at. Don't worry about memorizing it. That in itself isn't going to be on the test, but look at the table just so you can get an idea of how that works. You can segment by your customer type in terms of their area of expertise, the type of information that they're seeking after. You can segment by how they're using the product. Think Intel, for example. They're going after different types of end users. Those who manufacture computers are going to have a different need for chips than those who manufacture tablets, for example. And then also just their purchase behavior in terms of what they purchase and how they purchase it. Okay. If you are a supplier, if you are trying to sell into the B2B market, you're going to have to work with multiple buyers. In very large organizations, one buyer might be responsible for purchasing one type of product, and another buyer might be responsible for purchasing something else. I'll give you an example. I was working, again, with the same large distributor that I was telling you about. They wanted to find out about some of the end users of the decking products that they sold. They also wanted to find out about some of the other types of building products, drywall or paints, things like that. And so as I was out talking to their customers, I could call into a hardware store. For example, I called into Home Depot headquarters, and I talked to one buyer who bought some of the decking products. I talked to another buyer who bought some of the paint products and things like that. Certainly, the purchasing process is much more formal, much more professional than in the consumer market. It's typically more complex. It requires a much larger time frame. The relationships are more complex. It does require a lot more communication skills. There's greater reliance on relationship marketing in terms of really establishing those long-term relationships. It's a lot harder to get into a large business to get their business than what it might be for a smaller company. If you think about selling a product that costs $30,000, it's a lot more risk involved than if you're buying French fries from either McDonald's or Wendy's. And so they're a buyer of a B2B type of product is typically not going to give their larger dollar business to an unknown company. So you might have to go in there and start out small. So when I try and sell, for example, consulting services, which is very much B2B type of sales, if I'm going after a brand new client for the first time, I might not be able to sell them a full out marketing plan, which is a lot more expensive than just doing a couple hours of consulting. So I might have to come in on this, on the lower end, get them to see what I can do, get them to trust what I can do, and then I can sell them to more of the long-term, higher dollar type of services. And then certainly, if you're a not-for-profit organization, those types of things are important as well in terms of the buyer-seller relationship, and really anything that companies can do to establish goodwill is key here. Okay, so international business marketing. I'm not going to cover this too much. We already talked about that. There's certainly purchasing patterns are different. Global sourcing is really looking at goods and services from suppliers worldwide, which can help reduce cost savings, but it requires adjustments in terms of how your sales force operates, in terms of the cycle it takes to get the products over here, and working with some of the distributors of building products. One of the manufacturers was located overseas, and so in order to get a product from overseas into the distribution channel is a lot more involved, has some other types of complexities to it than, say, in a domestic-based business there. Okay, so the categories of business market demand. You can look at this wheel here. I'm going to talk about each one. So what is derived demand? Well, derived demand is essentially the linkage between the demand for a company's output, or what it can provide, and its purchase of resources. So for example, if we go back to the example with Intel, the demand for computer microprocessor chips is derived from demand for personal computers. If personal computer sales are down, then the demand for microprocessor chips might also be down. All right, volatile demand, let's move across there to the green, is for the opposite of derived demand. It has to do with the impact of volatility in a business market. So the demand for gasoline pumps may be reduced if demand for gasoline slows down. So the more volatile the market, it's going to adjust based upon the volatility of that market that you're in. Now let's move across to the yellow there. The joint demand is demand for a product that depends on the demand for another product used in combination with it. So for example, if lumber supply falls, then the drop in housing construction will affect the demand for concrete. So if you're looking at making something out of wood, and all of a sudden there's a drop in supply for lumber, well, that's going to increase the cost. And so assuming that concrete wasn't impacted from it for the same reason, then it might shift from purchasing lumber to purchasing concrete. Inelastic demand, let's go over there to the red. That's basically the demand throughout an industry, and it won't change significantly due to a price change. So sticking with construction firms, they'll not necessarily buy more lumber if prices fall unless overall demand for housing also increases. And so if you're a lumber company, you can't necessarily go to the builders and say, hey, I have a extra supply of lumber. I'm going to drop my prices. Are you interested? If the demand for housing isn't there, if the demand for the end users of lumber isn't there, it doesn't matter how much you offer it for. You're going to have a difficult time getting others to buy it if the demand isn't there. Because if they buy it, they have to keep it as inventory. So they might say, this is a great deal on lumber. Right now, we don't really have the demand for it, but wow, you're giving me a great deal, so I'm going to purchase X number of cords of lumber. But now that builder has to carry it on their balance sheet as inventory costs, and so it's not necessarily a wise decision. Inventory adjustments are adjustments in inventory and inventory policies, which can impact business demand. You may have heard or hear or will hear, and certainly if you've read the textbook, you'll see it in there as well. Just-in-time inventory, or JIT. These policies boost efficiency by cutting inventory and requiring vendors to deliver inputs as they are needed by the production process. So let's take something, for example, if you're trying to put together a car. So putting together a car, and there's thousands of parts that would go with a car. Let's say that you purchase your spark plugs from Champion. Well, instead of Champion just sending you thousands and thousands of spark plugs, which are going to send in inventory, you're able to keep track of your inventory. You have a good sense of how many cars you're going to be manufacturing in the next month, and you're going to tell Champion to only send you the number of spark plugs that you need. And the idea is that you don't have any excess. Now, it's impossible to predict it perfectly, but if you have a sense of how many cars you're going to produce, then you're going to know that you're going to want X number of spark plugs. However, you never know when you might get an order in to manufacture more cars, and so you have to make sure that you do have some spark plugs in stock, and likewise, you don't know when they might cut production, and so you don't want to have too many extra as well. So there's some things that are done in terms of adjusting inventory and forecasting, which can help along that area. Okay, another type of decision that has to be made within the B2B world is whether or not you make the products yourself, you purchase it from someone else, or you lease it. So certainly each of these have some degree of a loss of control. If you lease it from another organization, you're not going to have as much control over the pricing and over how much you can have than if you make it yourself. However, if you make it yourself, increased costs involved, some increased risks. So when should you do it? Well, you know, I mean, there's production classes that you can take. There's classes in business strategy. So there's no way that I can cover everything here, but just a few things to keep in mind. If you have the capacity and you have the experience, if it makes sense, then you probably want to manufacture the good or service in-house. If it doesn't make sense, if you don't have the capacity, if you don't have the expertise, then maybe you purchase it from somebody else, which could be costly, and now all of a sudden you're at their mercy for how much they're going to charge you. And if they raise their prices, are you able to raise your prices? Or if they raise their prices and you go somewhere else, is that going to impact the quality of your product? And it's similar for leasing. Although leasing, you can spread it out or spread the costs out over time. It does keep your options open a little bit. Here's an example of Frito-Lay. So my dad loves the barbecue Fritos, although he doesn't love them as much as he did in the 70s. And so I was talking to him about this one day when he heard that I was working at Frito. He said, "Hey, will you ask them a question for me? Will you ask why they started using less barbecue powder on their Fritos recently than they did back in the late 70s and early 80s? I've been wondering that for years, and it's really bugging me, and since you work for Frito, will you ask them that?" And I thought, wow, Dad, you must have a lot of time on your hands if you're thinking about barbecue Fritos. But certainly it's a valid question. And so I did ask somebody at Frito, and she didn't know. But what she suspected is perhaps the vendor changed, the person they purchased their spices from, their barbecue powder from. Perhaps they raised their prices or went out of business, or they changed their formulation. And so that was a risk that Frito-Lay had to take. And I can tell you from my experience with Frito-Lay, for example, those types of decisions in terms of things that will impact the taste of the product are made with a lot of care. There is a huge process that's involved. There are actually trained taste testers who actually have trained their mouth through, or have gone through training at Frito-Lay headquarters in Plano to train their mouth to pick up on tiny differences that the average consumer wouldn't be able to. So anyway, I got off topic there, but certainly there are advantages and disadvantages. So if Frito-Lay just really loved their spice that they put on the barbecue Fritos, then it might be to their advantage to make their own barbecue Frito spice instead of having it shipped in from someone else. So that's where I was going with that long tangent about barbecue Fritos and my dad having way too much time on his hand. All right, so offshoring and outsourcing. There's problems which come with this. There's also advantages. Certainly moving high-wage jobs from one country to lower-cost jobs overseas. There's not only some social and political impact on this, but certainly you're at the mercy of somebody else. You're sending your operations in the hands of somebody else. There's nearshoring, which is basically moving jobs to vendors in countries close to the business's home country. And so you might want to be close to a vendor or to a business that's close to you. And so regardless of where you are, you're going to set up this little camp almost where you're able to work closer together. All right, outsourcing, certainly using vendors to provide goods and services that may have produced in-house. There's a cost reduction in some respect because you don't have to have all the overhead and the expertise on hand to do that. Sometimes you can get it faster and at higher quality than if you have somebody on site to do it, and there's typically some sort of a value in it. Going back to when I sold staffing services, it was a cost reduction on their part because all the risk of having employees work for you were moved to my organization, as an example. All right, so the business buying process. I think you will find that this is not a lot different than the consumer buying process, except it's a little bit more steps involved, and some of that is because of all the evaluation that goes on in terms of what you're looking to do here. So the first part is to anticipate a problem, a need, or an opportunity. So let's look at it this way, okay? Let's walk through with the example of wanting to provide employees with a good cup of coffee. Okay, so it's very simple, but I think this will work. All right, so if you want to provide your employees with a good cup of coffee to enhance their productivity, so you've recognized the problem and you found a solution. Let's give them more coffee. So the next thing you have to do is determine what types of characteristics and the quantity that you need. So you might say, okay, we want a coffee system that's going to brew 1 cup of coffee at a time according to each employee's preferences. Okay? After you do that, you're going to describe the characteristics and the quantity of a needed good and service. And so this is actually writing it out and making it more of an organizational mandate, or somehow putting it into the hands of the buying process. So for example, if you need a simple system for brewing a good cup of coffee, quantity requirements are easily correlated to the number of coffee drinkers. So you're able to then make the business case that you have 1,000 employees. Of that, 3/4 are coffee drinkers, and so now you're getting a lot more specific. After you know what you need and the specifics of it, you're then going to go and look for someone who can give it to you. So the choice here for coffee, it could be relatively straightforward, or maybe it's more complex, and maybe you find this incredible coffee making system that before you didn't think of. Maybe there's a way that you can have one system that then has different hoses that can go to each floor of your business, and all you were thinking about was having a massive coffee machine that can make cups of coffee. But now all of a sudden, as you've sought things out, you've realized there's this system that can actually send coffee through pipes and hoses all throughout the organization. All right, so now you're going to go through and you're going to get some proposals. And so maybe you go as complex as that system of moving coffee to something as simpler, such as an industrial strength coffee maker. And you have an idea of what you want to spend, but at the same time, you're curious to see what else is out there. So you're going to get some bids, you're going to meet with the different vendors, find out what they have. They're going to submit the proposals, which then brings it to step number 6. And typically those proposals are evaluated on very specific criteria. Especially in large organizations, there really is a set scorecard that you have to go through. I remember sitting in on a bid process for a football field, all that was involved in designing this football field, from the engineering to the irrigation, the turf, etc. And it was it was with a school board, and so they had a very specific scorecard where they had to score someone on criteria so that the vendors who weren't selected could see where they fell in each area. Now, in smaller organizations, the evaluation process might be a lot simpler, not as complex. And in many ways, especially in smaller organizations, it could be very much based on relationships, especially if it's a company you've worked with and you trust. So there might be an organization, a vendor who submits a proposal, let's say for this coffee machine, and maybe it is 10 to 15% higher than what the others are coming in at, but you've had experience with this vendor, you know they make good products, you know that they offer good customer service, and so you're then willing to perhaps choose them over somebody else. Okay, so then you select the order routine. So basically the buyer and the vendor then work together to figure out the best process for future purchases. So they might say, you know what, just send us fresh coffee each month, or they might install some kind of a inventory system so that the vendor will know how much coffee they have, or whatever it might be, and you're going to work out the terms of it. And then the last step, obtain feedback, evaluate the performance, evaluate the vendor's performance, talk to your employees. Is this coffee machine giving what you want? Is it indeed increasing productivity, etc.? Okay. So as you go through this decision-making process, as you begin to sell these services, You're going to need to have merchandisers and category advisors and others who are there along the way. So merchandisers are basically trade buyers who secure needed products at the best possible prices, and then they sell it within the distribution channel, or sometimes you can purchase wholesale as well. So a merchandising unit is going to figure out the needs both of the industry. They're hopefully going to know what's going on in the industry, any trends, etc. They're going to look at the suppliers, and then they're going to make the purchasing decisions there. System integration is really centralizing this procurement and selection function within an organization. And then a category advisor is a trade industry vendor who develops some kind of a plan for the retail buyer. So if you are looking at taking your product throughout this distribution channel, there's advisors, there's others who can work with you to kind of understand what the needs are. Okay, so buying situations. There's lots of ways that goods and services are bought. There is a straight rebuy, which is basically a recurring purchase. You know it's worked well in the past, and you're going to keep buying that. A modified rebuy is where you say, okay, I'm willing to reevaluate my options, and then repurchase another good or service. And sometimes you're going to purchase from the same vendor, but perhaps at a different terms or different product, or you might go out and get something new altogether. Okay, a new task rebuy. And this is a slide that I meant to show you. So I talked to you about a straight rebuy and a modified rebuy. Now I'm going to talk about new task and reciprocity. So a new task rebuy is a first considerable effort on the part of decision makers. For example, we decided we're going to look into some kind of a coffee system. And then reciprocity is buying from suppliers who are also customers. So how might that work? Well, let's say you are a large printing company. Okay, you print marketing materials, you print business cards, etc. And one of your clients happens to be A1 Coffee Systems. Well, A1 Coffee Systems is one of the vendors, if not the only one, depending on your policies. But A1 vendor is, or A1 Coffee Supply is the vendor who you selected for this coffee system. So you buy their coffee system and they buy marketing materials from you. So it's this reciprocity, this win-win situation. Okay, so then after you make these purchases, you need to kind of analyze and see how well you're doing. So the value analysis is a study of the components of a purchase to determine this most cost-effective approach, and then a vendor analysis is looking at the vendor and their performance in terms of price, back orders, how well they delivered what you needed, things like that. So if we go back to these purchase decision slides that I showed earlier, as you're evaluating this, you might look and say, okay, we are using A1 Coffee Systems. One, is this the most cost-effective approach to improve our productivity? And if it is A1 Coffee Systems still the best vendor for us? Now, if you have used reciprocity, it certainly creates a little bit different dynamic, because now if you decide A1 Coffee Systems isn't really the vendor for you for your coffee, well, you take the chance that they might decide that you're not the one for them for their printing. So all of those are involved in this decision process. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about buying centers. So a buying center is basically all the participants in an organization's buying habits. So you have users, those who actually use the goods or services. You have the gatekeepers, those who control the information that all the buying center members will review. So let's go back to our coffee system example again. Okay, now we are A1 coffee systems now. All the information that we try and bring into the organization is going to go through some kind of a gatekeeper. Often the gatekeeper is thought of as the receptionist or the office manager, and that certainly is a gatekeeper. But the gatekeeper can also then be somebody else, perhaps a little bit further up in the hierarchy of the organization, who might decide whether or not this is going to get out, this is going to be something that's on the agenda, something that's considered. And then the people who actually use the good or service. So within our organization, we're looking to purchase this coffee system now. We might involve the employees in the process. We might involve human resources. We might involve IT in it if there's some kind of an alert that is sent out when coffee is available. We might want to involve our facilities people, especially if they're going to be drilling holes in the wall, things like that. So it's not just the end user of the coffee, although we could certainly ask the employees as well, but it's all those who are somewhat involved in this decision. And so as a marketer, these are all the factors that need to be considered. I guess this is where now this comes back to just straight marketing. As you go to market your good or service, you need to consider the role of the buying centers. Who is using this, all that's involved in it, and then who are the gatekeepers, where might we get hung up, who do we need to market to? Do we need to send one of our best talkers, one of our smooth talkers out to get in the door so they can get past the receptionist, for example? And then within that, there's influencers, there's the deciders, and there's the buyers. So the influencers are those who supply the information, who talk about the alternatives. So perhaps you asked, or perhaps we asked our office manager to gather some information on coffee systems. So the office manager might be an influencer because they met with each of the individuals. They were probably taken out to lunch by some of them. They were wined and dined and smoozed, and they saw all the presentations. Well, your marketing to the influencers is going to be different than what it might be to the deciders. So the deciders, typically the influencers will give the information to the deciders, or maybe they will be the ones who determine if you get to come in and make a presentation. So now you're going to be giving different information to the deciders than you will to the influencers. And then the buyers are the ones who have the final authority. Sometimes the buyer is actually there as part of the presentation, and sometimes they're not. So if we're presenting our coffee system, okay, let's back up for a minute. So now we are going to be A1 coffee systems. So we are A1 coffee systems, and we've done our due diligence, and we've been able to get information to the influencers, and they have helped our company, A1 Coffee Systems, get in front of the deciders, those who are going to choose whether or not to recommend or to issue a presentation to these people. Maybe it's going to be the Chief Operations Officer and the VP of Human Resources, and perhaps some of our frontline managers are going, or some of their frontline managers are going to be in the meeting. So we're going to present to them in a different way than we would to the influencers. But the buyer might be the CFO or the CEO, and we might not ever see them. So we're going to need to make sure that we're giving information in a compelling manner so that the HR director or operations person, whoever it is, has the right information in a very straightforward way that they can then give to the buyer, who ultimately will give the sign-off on it. All right. Along that same line of buying centers, there's international buying centers. We talked about this already for the most part. There's certainly cultural differences. There's just other obstacles, other layers that are in the way. There's political and economic issues that need to be considered also. Okay, so how do you develop effective B2B marketing strategies? Well, it has to be based on that particular organization's buying behavior, their buying center, their buying situation. So while you might have some kind of a template for a presentation or for a proposal, it's going to have to be adapted based upon their needs. Think of it as creating 5 or 6 different types of commercials based upon the consumer that you're going after in the B2C world. However, it's a little bit different because now it's not just going to be 5 or 6 different proposals. You're probably going to make a change to every single one that you meet with. And along those lines, and this is just a caution, I have been in presentations, and shamefully I've been on the other side of it too, where you do use a template or you use something that you've used in the past. So, let's say that we are A1 Coffee Systems. We're selling to a printing company, and in the past we sold this to another printing company. So we sold to Jones Printing, and now we're presenting to Smith's Printing. It's going to be a little bit different, and you might tweak it based upon the needs, but sometimes what's happened is you're presenting to Jones Printing Company and you leave the name Smith Printing Company in there too. Yeah, that's bad. Don't do that. So pay attention to it, and it's important to think about your customer who you're selling to, and then always get it checked with a second set of eyes. That I've seen it on both sides. And then you also have government markets, which is also part of B2B marketing, and they're influenced by social goals, they're influenced by political parties, by the political environment that's out there. Contractual guidelines are important. You'll need to go through different selling organizations, different buying organizations. There's rules that have to be followed, policies. There's things that have to be reported. If you are a government organization, you have to report gifts that you get or attempted gifts that you get and things like that. GSA, Government Service Agency. If you want to sell to a government organization, to the federal government, you're going to need to work through GSA, and it's important to get registered as a qualified vendor and go through that process. And there is a complex bidding process, and there's actually marketers who make their money off of teaching companies how to market to the government. So there's consultants who say, I can teach you how to win government bids. Now, if you win government bids, it usually pays pretty good. That joke about costing $7,000 for a screw for the space shuttle isn't a joke. That's, well, okay, it might not be $7,000, but I worked in the inventory control center for a company back after high school, just before college or during the summer. And it was a company that had Goddard Space Flight Center as one of their large clients. It was an aerospace company. And I worked in one of their inventory, in one of their bonded storage rooms. And so I would, if somebody came and said they wanted a screwdriver, they wanted a bolt or a screw, I'd have to check it out and go through this process. And I can tell you, I can go to Ace Hardware and I can get a screw for 25 cents. It wasn't 25 cents for that same screw with that government agency. It's a lot more. Now, some of it is supposed to be a lot more carefully designed. It can hold up under more pressure, but still, if you can get into the government, you can probably make some money off of it, except you have to deal with government shutdowns and uncertainties and things like that. So, but the government is online as well. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes not so much. I think you all are aware of some other websites the government has that aren't working out too well, but certainly the government is going online and using technology too. Institutions, selling to institutions such as schools, hospitals, libraries, they still have very diverse buying practices. Certainly a school board is going to get a bid from anything for someone to redesign their football field, all the way up to who provides their food for school lunches. Certainly group purchasing is an important factor. The Mansfield School District, where my kids go, has 20 or so schools in that district, and so they can certainly get, if they can get some kind of a volume discount. So if I was selling something for the schools, I wouldn't go to the individual schools. I'd go to the Mansfield School District, and then if I can get in one school, hopefully I can get into 20 schools. Or if I want to go even further, if I can get into the State Board of Education, then hopefully I can get into some of the And international marketing, we've talked about this, just the attitudes, cultures. You know what, I'm going to skip this. We've discussed this. Okay, so now you are up to your discussion board portion here. So you're going to watch this video, and we've watched Flight 001, but we're going to watch this version of it and answer these questions. So you are to answer both of these questions. You must answer or address all the topics in order to receive all the points. So, for example, the second bullet point actually has 3 questions. What conflicts might arise? Do you think their wholesale retail strategy is sound? Why or why not? So all those need to be addressed. So go ahead and answer that sometime between now and when we are in class on Tuesday. And whenever you're ready to listen to me again, go ahead and listen to the next lecture.